Welcome to the Western Spirit. Today we'll be talking with Professor Alan Dershowitz, renowned law professor and great, lover of Israel and the Jewish people, and someone who I've been wanting to talk to for a very long time. So, Professor Dershowitz, it's an honor to finally speak to you.
Well, it's my honor to speak to you. I've heard wonderful things about you and about your podcast.
Thank you so much. And so, I guess my first question is, but just to set things up. We're about 4 or 5 months from October 7th. And just now, when I came into the studio, we saw another two Jews get killed just because they're Jewish. And we have, like, the entire country here is in a situation where, very tense, everybody's on edge. And then we look at the U.S. and we see these huge mass protests against Israel, sometimes even pro-Hamas. Have you, when in your long experience of living in the U.S. and being a Jew in America, have you ever felt that it has been so crazy like it is now in terms of the anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias?
Not even close. The closest this comes is to Nazi Germany in the 1930s with demonstrations at the University of Munich, the University of Berlin, and other universities in which Jews were attacked, in which classes were broken into, in which lectures were disrupted. Nothing in America has come close to this. And remember, I was a lawyer for many of the protesters during the 1960s and the 1970s, and they were violent, many of them, but nothing comes close to this. This is essentially equivalent to Nazi youth in the 1930s. The protesters are mostly ignorant. They know nothing about Israel. They don't know nothing about Hamas. All they know is that they're joining a demonstration based on intersectionality, where there are oppressors and oppressed, and Jews are the oppressors, and Palestinians are the oppressed. These are not pro-Palestine demonstrations. These are anti-Israel, anti-American, and anti-Jewish demonstrations, and they're getting worse, and they're spreading beyond the campus. There were demonstrations the other day at a film festival, and people were asked what river, what sea. They had no idea. They were asked about Hamas, and one of them said, well, Hamas isn't in Gaza. Only Jews are in Gaza. They were asked about the hostages, and they expressed ignorance about that. These are emotional anti-Israel and anti-American demonstrations. Scratch an anti-Israel person, and you will get an anti-American person. Scratch a little deeper, and you will generally get an anti-Jewish person as well.
Yeah, maybe I'll just, in terms of your years and years at Harvard, and we see, I mean, Harvard has become basically I guess, the poster child for what's happening in the academic world in the West. We saw what happened with the president, Claudine Gay.
Right.
We saw different, crazy protests, Jewish students talking openly about being scared to go into certain libraries or
Yeah.
areas on campus. So what is happening on American campuses, and do you see anything getting better?
Well, first of all, I wish it were true that Harvard was the poster child. Believe it or not, Harvard is better than many other schools. Harvard is much better than Berkeley. Harvard is much better than Columbia. Harvard is much better than many universities around the country. The acting president of Harvard is Jewish and a Zionist and somebody who goes to a conservative shul. I don't know how long he'll be acting president, but there are at least some efforts, and I'm not here to defend Harvard. I was strongly opposed to the appointment of Gay, and I've strongly favored her forced resignation. But other universities are much worse, and other institutions are almost as bad as universities. Now, the universities are the worst because they tell us about the future. But let's remember and put this in context. Nazism started at universities, and Hitler was bolstered largely by young university students. Stalinism was supported by universities. Castroism was supported by universities. Pol Pot and Mao Zedong. Young people can be the most dangerous people in the world, and so don't give them any excuses Another group that is deeply at fault here is Jewish leadership in the United States. They are cowards. They refuse to speak up. I have been canceled myself because my views on Israel are regarded as too strident. I have been canceled at Temple Emmanuel in New York, the largest Reformed temple, Cardozo Law School, which is Yeshiva University's law school. The dean said, we're not ready for Dershowitz yet. I've been canceled by the 92nd Street Y, by groups from the Federation, by the largest Reformed temple in the Miami area, Beth Am. They are all terrified about standing up to this anti-Semitism and kind of upsetting people and provoking people. Many Jewish leaders today are behaving so much like the Jewish leaders behaved in the 1930s and early 1940s because they want to preserve their own status. They're comfortable, they're happy. Sure, their children may be being miseducated, but they're still doing very, very well
Yeah.
socially, economically, politically, and they don't want to rock the boat. Look, 30 years ago, I wrote a book called Chutzpah, in which I said that Jews need more chutzpah. And boy, if we ever needed more chutzpah, we need it today. We have to prioritize our concerns for Israel over every other concern. It's time for an imain anili mili. We
Yeah.
have done so much on the other side. If I am for myself alone, what am I? And imlo achshav ematai. We have to do it now, and we have to do it firmly and strongly. And our leadership is not giving us that today when we need it most.
Yeah, I agree. And I just want to ask one last question about what's happening in the U.S. It seems to me that we used to talk when I was a youngster in Brooklyn about when you spoke about anti-Semitism was usually you thought about like a neo-Nazi on the right wing, someone who marches with the swastika, some crazy person. And, you had, I want to ask you later about Skokie and what you think about what's happening with the marches today. But what I do want to ask you is, it seems that the main anti-Semitism in America today is on the academic left, the progressive movement, it's at least on the fringes of it. And you have these this weird alliance between Islamists and woke. Like the funny thing is that Queers for Palestine. It comes from that intersectionality sort of left wing movement.
Yeah.
How do we Is there any truth to the fact that most Jews in America are left wing and therefore they feel a little more apprehension to maybe come strong forcefully out against these groups?
Well, I think that's part of the case. Look, you left out one major group. There is incredibly growing anti-Semitism within the black community, particularly within young people and within Christian churches. The two of the leading Christian churches, representing perhaps millions today of African American worshipers, have come out unequivocally against Israel, calling for a unilateral ceasefire, no mention of the hostages, some of them even denying Israel's right to defend itself and therefore essentially to exist. So we're seeing a large combination of elements against against Israel, and we're not prepared for it. We're not ready for it.
Yeah.
And we have to stand up to it. Some of it started with the Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement. Look at Me Too. Me Too, unless you're a Jew.
Yeah.
You have the Me Too movement and other feminist movements refuse to recognize that there were massive rapes and that the rapes were part of the war plan of Hamas. Many refuse to recognize the mutilations. I had dinner the other night with the father of the young Israeli soldier who was beheaded and whose head was put up for sale for $10,000. And even despite that, people say, no, there's no evidence of rape, there's no evidence of mutilation. What Israel did was, what Hamas did was in self-defense. Look, let's remember that although October 7th was terrible, October 8th may have been even worse, because after October 7th, before Israel sent a single troop into Gaza, we saw the anti-Semitism bubble up from organizations like the National Lawyers Guild, the second largest bar association in America, which said that what Hamas did was perfectly acceptable and a military act. We saw 33 groups at Harvard, including Amnesty International, blame October 7th on the Jews. So, you can't think of these things just as October 7th. I wrote a book on October 7th. I started writing it called War Against the Jews. I started it on October 7th. I finished it on November 5th,
Wow.
and it was published by December 5th. Probably the fastest book ever published. But in the book, I focus on three dates. Uh, One is October 6th, one is October 7th, one's October 8th. October 6th stands for Israel's lack of preparation, both intelligence wise and also lack of response to the immediate attack on the 7th. The 7th we all know about. And the 8th deals with how the fact that Israel showed its weakness, showed it was vulnerable, caused an enormous increase in anti Semitism in the United States, on college campuses, and around the world. This is by people who are sitting ready to go after Israel, but they needed an excuse. And they didn't wait for Israel to go into Gaza. It was enough that Israel showed its vulnerability, that it was subject to this kind of a horrendous pogrom that caused anti-Semitism. And, I think we're the only group, when we're attacked, that increases the anti-Semitism because people feel emboldened and ready to say what they have been thinking for many years without fear that
Right.
they will have consequences for it. So the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th are all terrible days in Jewish history. If we could rewrite the calendar and have another Tisha B'Av, I think we would add to Tisha B'Av,
Yeah.
October 6th, 7th, and 8th, as days that were in some ways reminiscent of the destruction of the temple.
I agree. I want to turn now to something that's also your expertise. One of the things that this week Israel responded to the ICC, the International Court of, I forgot the exact name of it, in The
Well,
Hague.
we get it because it's not international. It's not a real court, and it has nothing to do with justice. It's
Right.
not international because it doesn't include all countries. It's not a court because the judges are appointed by the government and often are responsive to the government. For example, Lebanon's judge obviously is a Hezbollah judge, and it has nothing to do with justice. Recall the decision, the horrible decision it rendered about the security fence that protected the lives of so
Right.
many Israelis and Palestinians. So I have nothing but contempt for the International Court of Justice. It's not a court, and it shouldn't be recognized, and nobody should pay any moral attention or legal attention to it.
So do you think that Israel made a mistake that they even sent someone there to try to defend itself?
Well, as you know, I was asked about that and asked whether I would be willing to participate in that event. I think Israel probably should not have recognized the court's jurisdiction over it. But once it did put together a good team of lawyers, and it got a surprisingly moderate response to the first case. But I assure you that as it goes further and further, the International Court of Justice will become a major enemy of Israel.
Yeah.
The real issue is what will happen with the International Criminal Court. That is not necessarily a UN court. The judges there are not appointed by governments and are not answerable to governments. And we'll wait and see whether or not they can administer anything that resembles justice. But believe me, the courts in Israel are far more capable of doing justice than any international court.
Yeah, there was also rumors that you were going to be asked to be the judge in terms of for Israel on the bench
No,
there, and they picked Ron Barak. Was that something that even was spoken to you or anything? Or
no,
it was
never been.
rumored in Israeli media. I just wanted to see if you had
No.
any.
Our brilliant choice and a courageous choice. Because
Yeah,
remember that at the time he was chosen, he and the prime minister were disagreeing
yeah,
about judicial reform. But it took courage for the Israeli government to appoint Aaron Barak, who is probably the most brilliant living judge in America today. And he rendered a good concurring opinion, and I hope he'll continue to serve on the court and push it and nudge it closer to justice. Though I'm not optimistic
yeah.
that this court is capable of doing justice for Israel.
Also, the fact that he's a Holocaust survivor gives it a little more a little more meaning. The fact that they're, a Holocaust survivor is there and they're, trying to basically judge Israel for defending itself. It's a little bit,
No, I've known Aaron since 1966. We're
wow.
very close friends. But my views on him are not objective. I've also known Benjamin Netanyahu since 1970, and Today it's very hard for people to talk to each other, and I hope they will talk to each other, because both Netanyahu and Barak are among the most brilliant people in leadership positions in the world today. You can agree, you can disagree with what they've done, you can disagree with how far they've gone, both of them. We're not asking, nobody's asking for complete agreement. Two Jews, three opinions,
Yeah.
two Israelis, 15 newspapers, and 12 parties. So don't expect agreement, but at least expect some degree of mutual respect. And I think we have that between Barak and Netanyahu.
Yeah. One more question about the protests. As I mentioned before, there was the very famous Skokie case where the neo-Nazis were wanted to march there, and basically, if I read also online that at the time you were one of the people who said and defended the fact that they should have the right to march, and because of the principle of free speech and the First Amendment. And then you have these marches today. Are there any, lines that show that is there any comparable situation here, or is there a limit where people from the river to
Mhm.
the sea, which basically means wipe out the Jews from Israel, should that be
Look,
allowed under the First Amendment?
I've been thinking, writing, and litigating about this for 60 years. I have brought some of the major cases before the courts on freedom of speech. And for me, the line is between protest and violence. And so I did defend the rights of Nazis to peacefully, even though they were provocative and they were horrible, peacefully march through Skokie. And I do defend the rights of people to protest, even my own speeches. When I spoke at Temple Emmanuel last week and there were protesters in the audience, Temple Emmanuel in Miami. I can't speak in Temple Emmanuel in New York, they banned me. But Temple Emmanuel in Miami, there were protesters. And when the police started to take the protesters out, I said, no, let them stay. Let them ask me a question, and I'll answer the question. As long as it's substantive and as long as there's no violence, our First Amendment and Israel's basic laws permit free speech that's obnoxious and offensive and even scary. But the line is at violence. What happened at Berkeley the other night crossed over that line, where Hamas, pro Hamas, and anti Israel rioters broke into a speech, prevented a young Israeli lawyer soldier from speaking, spat on Jews, and attacked them physically. Lines are crossed when physical violence or harassment, direct harassment, is employed. But you can say anything you please, even river to the sea. Of course, recently a journalist interviewed people who were yelling river to the sea at the Sundance Festival, and none of them knew what river or what sea.
Yeah.
Many of the people who claim to be pro-Palestinian don't know the difference between Palestine and the Palisades, or between the Jordan River and the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
And so the ignorance is just appalling. But the First Amendment, freedom of speech, protects ignorant speech as well as intelligent speech.
I have another question about you. You're very versed in what's happening in Israel, especially on the political and as it relates especially to the judicial
Right.
side. And one of the things we've seen up to October 7, the year coming up to October 7, was the whole big mass protests in Israel about the judicial reform bill. Yariv Levin brought it up in January last year, and just right away sparked huge protests. And from both sides, the Israeli society is fractured coming into October 7. We know that the terrorists themselves were saying, and intelligence now says that they understood that Israeli society was so fractured, it was an
Yeah.
opportunity for them to attack us at that time.
Yeah, I don't think that for a minute. I
No?
think that they planned the attack well before the judicial reform. They used judicial reform as an excuse. In my new book, War Against the Jews, I have a long chapter on the judicial reform. Look, I was opposed to much of the judicial reform. I was in favor of some of it in a limited way, but Israel was conducting itself in a completely democratic fashion. Every Saturday night, there were demonstrations. There were peaceful demonstrations. People weren't hurt. People didn't like each other, and people were cursing each other. But it was a paradigm of democratic free speech.
Yeah.
And, it proved, along with Israel's multiple elections, that Israel is one of the most vibrant democracies in the world. And that democracy includes Israeli Arabs, it includes Israeli Christians, and it includes Israeli Haredim. It includes the widest variety. It's also Israel, the most diverse country in the Middle East and one of the most diverse in the world, ethnically and even racially. We see Ethiopian Jews in positions of great honor and authority. Israel has problems. Every country has problems, and there are divisions within Israel. And I think a lot of those divisions have been solved, at least momentarily, after October 7th, when all of Israel was attacked. Remember, the attack was directed against people on the left, people who are peaceniks, people who are employing many Gazans and giving them money. And the Gazans, some of them at least, were being used as spies by Hamas. So, this is not a time to talk about two-state solutions.
Yeah.
It's not a time to talk about the year after, the day after. It's a time for Israel to win the war. It's a time for Israel to ignore world public opinion, to thumb its nose and ignore the Red Cross, Physicians Without Borders, UNRWA, the United Nations. Israel has to make its own decision. Tragically, Israel cannot completely ignore the United States, but it cannot be dictated to by the United States. I remember the story of when Menachem Begin told the President of the United States, sorry, we make our own decisions here. And I think that has to be true here. We in the United States have to take responsibility for assuring American support. Recent polls show that among older Americans, support for Israel is very, very high. It's among younger Americans, and that's why we have a problem. And that's why the Jewish leadership, most of it, I don't want to generalize, most of the Jewish leadership is failing to recognize that we have a deep problem about our future, because college students today who are marching are tomorrow's leaders, and we can only wonder what the leadership will be like when people who are marching for Hamas today are in Congress.
Right.
We already have some,
Mm-hmm.
but most elected members of legislatures across the country today are supportive of Israel. That's not necessarily the case 10 years from now.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you, what relates to what you just said, is that it seems, and we have reports now on the Washington Post I saw last week, and now in a few more outlets and in Israeli media as well, that the Biden administration is trying to, it seems, use this war to get a ceasefire and then do some sort of dictate to Israel for a two-state solution, there's now, we know that the Palestinian Authority's government disbanded. They want to maybe bring people from Hamas into the next government of the Palestinians. How should Israel look at what the U.S. is doing?
Well,
we need
first of
America,
all,
we love America, but on the other hand, we don't want to be dictated to by America.
not only that, but America is often wrong. It's wrong here. Hamas must not be allowed to have a victory. And there cannot be a two-state solution that's based on October 7th. It just cannot happen based on October 7th. October 7th requires a complete dismantling and destruction of Hamas. Once that's done, we can go back and talk about various possible solutions, but nothing will ever be the same. For example, there needs to be a barrier between Gaza and Israel. It cannot be that Hamas can come right up to the border and dig tunnels underneath. There has to be security done only by Israel, because that's the only country you can trust to do security. The same thing is true on the West Bank. But the key point is Hamas cannot be rewarded. Right now, Hamas, I hate to say this, is winning the war. They are winning October 7th. Yeah, sure, they're losing people. But they don't care about civilian Gazans who are lost. But what they're gaining is opinion in world around countries, Canada, Australia. I mean, friends of Israel, mostly fair weather friends, are turning against Israel. And that cannot be allowed, because if Hamas gets a victory in Israel, it's coming to a theater near you.
Yeah.
President Biden accurately recognized that if Putin is allowed to have a victory in Ukraine, he will move into other countries, including perhaps NATO countries. Why doesn't he understand the same thing is true of Hamas? Why doesn't he understand that Hamas and Putin have to be put in the same category. If Hamas is allowed a victory, it's going to expand. Hezbollah is going to expand. Islamic Jihad is going to expand. The radicals in Yemen are going to expand. This is a war in which Israel represents civilization, Western values, Judeo-Christian tradition, and decency against indecency. And too many people who claim to be decent are taking sides with the indecent here. And that is not acceptable.
Yeah.
And our neighbor to the north in Canada is turning around. I mean, it so quickly forgets its horrendous history of anti-Semitism. During and before the Second World War, Canada was the worst country in the world in terms of admitting Jews. Their minister of absorption once said, even one Jew is too many. And what did they do after the war was over? Immediately admitted tens of thousands of Nazis from Ukraine without even vetting them, without asking them any questions. So don't talk to me about the morality of Canada. Canada's true morality is coming out now with Trudeau, whose father I knew and worked with on civil liberties. But Trudeau is now turning against Israel, along with other countries. Fortunately, there are still some countries that don't. But the same thing is true as what Abiy Ibn said 50 years ago. If Algeria introduced a resolution at the UN that the earth was flattened, that Israel was flattened, that it would win 143 to 27 with 73 abstentions, and he could name the abstentions. Even Great Britain didn't vote against the most recent horrendous. It abstained, but it didn't vote against. And many of the other countries voted for it. So, it's Israel versus the world. And let me give you the bad news. Israel has to prepare, not now, not 5 years from now, but for perhaps 10 years from now. Israel has to be prepared for the day when America will no longer support it. It is possible that in 10 years, young people who today want to see all aid to Israel cut off, even including some older people, all aid to Israel cut off, all alliances between Israel and the United States terminated. It is possible, not likely, but possible, that will occur in the next 10 years. Israel has to have a plan B. It has to have a mechanism, and I'm sure it does, for its own survival without the support of any single country in the world. That, tragically, has been the history of Jews. That's the history of the nation state of the Jewish people, the Jew among nations, Israel. And Israel has to be prepared for that possible eventuality. People like me will do everything in our power to prevent it from happening, but I'm 85 years old. If I were 25 years old, I wouldn't be talking to you today. I'd be in Gaza with a gun joining the IDF, but I'm not 25 years old, and my pen is mightier than my sword. And so I continue to write and speak. But there are not too many of us in America, and we have to be prepared for the eventuality that someday Israel may have to go to it alone. If it does, it has to survive, it has to thrive, and it has to become a light to the nations.
Yeah. Professor Dershowitz, one last question I want to ask you about before we finish about what's happening in the U.S. in terms of, we all see it here, and I follow what's happening in America because that's my birthplace, and my father still lives in New York, so I have family near you. And we've seen something that a lot of Israelis are looking and seeing maybe some parallels. But either way, what is happening with the fact it seems that politics has gone into the court system? Meaning you have a presidential election where it seems as if one side is using the judicial system to try to hamper, at least that's the way it looks for me, to try to stall. Or what do you think about what's happening there?
This is a book called Get Trump,
Okay.
in which a legal analysis of all the legal cases, both sides are trying to weaponize the Constitution, trying to weaponize the legal system. I have an article I wrote just about 2 weeks ago about how courts are playing too great a role in our election. The same thing is possible in Israel.
Yeah.
And it's important to keep the courts in the right place. Look, it's the book of Ruth, I think, that starts by saying, when judges ruled the land, there was famine. Judges shouldn't have too much power. They shouldn't be able to influence elections. And the Democrats are now trying to use the legal system to try to get Trump, to prevent him from running, to the extent of bringing a case, which is now in the Supreme Court, trying to disqualify him from the ballots in Colorado and
Yeah.
Maine and Illinois and other places. And they claim that doing it in the interest of democracy. What could be more undemocratic than denying the leading candidate? Look, I am not a Trump supporter. I voted for Biden. I voted for Obama. I wish I hadn't voted for Obama. That was a mistake. But I'm a Democrat. But I don't support the Republican efforts to try to use the legal system to disqualify Trump or to prevent him from running. I have a constitutional right to vote either for him or against him. At the moment, I plan to vote against him. Things may change. I could not vote for Biden if he turned against Israel. So far, the turn has been slight, but it's been discernible. I would like to see him go back to what he said on October 8th and October 9th and not be influenced by 100,000 Arab and Muslim votes in Michigan. But tragically, in an election year, people are influenced by those kinds of matters. I just want to make one more point,
Mm-hmm.
and that is not doing a good enough job in rebutting the claim that 30,000 civilians have been killed. The numbers are much, 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 much lower than that. In fact, Israel has killed fewer innocent civilians than any country in the history of urban warfare. Let's assume 30,000 people have been killed in Gaza. Hamas doesn't even distinguish between civilians and combatants. Israel claims 10,000 of them are combatants. What Hamas does is it says, but many of them are children, but children are 19 and 18 and 17, and Hamas uses child soldiers. They claim some are women. Well, of course, but women can be terrorists as well. And if people who allow their homes to be used to build tunnels and to store rockets, they're quasi-combatants. If you look at the figures realistically, there are probably no more than 10,000 really innocent, totally innocent civilians who have been killed. And if 10,000 combatants have been killed and 10,000 civilians, purely innocent civilians, have been killed, it's a 1-to-1 ratio, which is much better than the ratio of any country in the history of warfare. And so, look, Israel should always do everything in its power to avoid civilian casualties, and it does. But it should do also everything in its power to reveal the truth
Yeah.
about how few actually fully innocent civilians. I'm talking about the 3-year-old babies and the 90-year-old mothers. I'm not talking about the people who followed the Hamas into Israel as civilians and then participated in the killings, or people who harbored them, or people who allowed their hospitals. My son has come up with a great name for the hospitals in Gaza. He calls them Hamospitals, and they are
Yeah.
Hamospitals. They have been taken over by Hamas. We now have information that Hamas may have been building schools and mosques and maybe medical facilities deliberately on top of existing tunnels and existing to building the tunnels underneath existing structures. So the use of civilian shields is more massive than in any other war in history, and that story has to be told more effectively by Israel.
Yeah. Professor Dershowitz, when are you coming to Israel? We want to meet you.
As soon as I'm invited, I have come before to speak at Globes conferences and other conferences, and so when I'm invited and I have an opportunity to do it, I'm looking forward to going to Israel. I was there about a year ago, but I haven't been there since October 7th.
So we'd love to have you. And when you come, for whatever reason, you're more than invited for us for Shabbos dinner. So we'd love to. My wife cooks very good food, so we'd love to meet you.
Brooklyn from Crown Heights. Does your wife come from Brooklyn too?
No, my wife's Iraqi and Persian. Her family came from Baghdad and Tehran.
But happy to accept your invitation.
So, Professor Dershowitz, I want to thank you so much for coming to our podcast and to Globes, because it will be also in the newspaper. So I want to thank you so much for doing this, and it was a real honor and privilege. And I think that no matter what your opinion is in Israel in terms of right, left, center, whatever, it's good that we have a friend like you in America. And I really appreciate that you took the time to be with us today.
Well, thank you. you. As you know, I take no position on Israeli domestic
Yeah.
politics. All I make sure is that Israel remains a vibrant democracy, a democracy that's capable of defending itself. So I don't take positions on Israeli politics, but I follow it very closely.
Thank you so much, Professor Dershowitz, and we'll meet you when you come.